The night Marlon Brando turned his back on Hollywood, and Hollywood never forgave him for it. March 27, 1973. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles was glittering. Every light in the building was aimed at the most powerful people in American cinema. Diamonds flashed on the necks of women who had never once worried about next month's rent. Tuxedos pressed so sharply you could cut your hand on the lapel. And somewhere backstage, a young woman in a buckskin dress was trembling, holding a speech she had memorized word for word, knowing that in approximately 90 minutes she was either going to change history or be dragged off that stage by security before she got through the second sentence. Her name was Sacheen Littlefeather. She was 26 years old. She was Apache. And Marlon Brando had sent her there to do the one thing nobody in Hollywood ever did. Say no. Not a polite no. Not a gracious, humble no with tears and a thank you speech. A real no. A defiant, unmistakable, burn the bridges, I don't care what you think of me no. The kind of no that costs something. The kind of no that most people spend their entire lives too afraid to say. But here's what nobody tells you about that night. The real story didn't begin at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. It didn't begin in 1973 at all. It began in a small apartment in Omaha, Nebraska, decades earlier, with a little boy who couldn't make his parents stop fighting, and who learned very early that the only power he would ever truly own was the power of his own performance. And now that boy, grown into the most celebrated actor on the planet, was about to walk away from the biggest prize his industry could offer. You already know how the night ended, but I promise you, you don't know why. Marlon Brando Jr. was born on April 3, 1924. His father, Marlon Sr., was a traveling salesman, hard-drinking, emotionally cold, the kind of man who communicated his disapproval through long silences and sudden cruelties. His mother, Dorothy, was a woman who loved the theater, who had genuine talent, who had somehow gotten trapped inside a life that was too small for her. She drank, too. Different reasons, same result. Young Marlon grew up watching two people destroy each other slowly. And somewhere in those years of watching, absorbing, trying to understand the invisible forces that made people behave the way they did, he developed something that would become the foundation of his entire art. He learned how to read people with frightening accuracy. He learned that most people are performing most of the time, that the words coming out of someone's mouth are almost never the full story. What matters is what lives underneath the performance, the fear, the need, the thing a person is trying to hide from the world, and sometimes from themselves. This was not just a skill, it was survival. His father eventually sent him to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota. This was meant to straighten the boy out, to install some discipline where there was currently only defiance. It did not go according to plan. Marlon lasted at Shattuck long enough to get expelled. He had drilled a hole in the floor of the dormitory. His father, furious, told him to figure out his own life. And Marlon, 19 years old, ended up in New York City. What happened next would change American culture permanently. But before we get there, there's something you need to know about Marlon Brando that most people never talk about. Something that explains everything that came after. Something that makes the Oscar night not just a protest, but the inevitable conclusion of who he had always been. Marlon Brando never wanted fame. He wanted truth. Those are not the same thing. And in Hollywood, they are almost never the same thing. New York in the 1940s was alive in a way that's hard to describe. The actor's studio, method acting. The idea, radical at the time, that an actor should not simply perform emotion, but actually locate it. Find the real thing inside yourself. Stop pretending. Start living. Marlon walked into that world, and it was as if someone had handed him a key to a room he'd been circling his entire life. This was what all those years of watching his parents had been preparing him for. Not the performance, the truth underneath the performance. He was, by every account, a phenomenon. Teachers who had seen thousands of students said they had never seen anything quite like him. He could access emotional registers that other actors spent years trying to reach, and he could do it in the time it takes to draw a breath. In 1951, a film called A Streetcar Named Desire, Stanley Kowalski, animal, violent, magnetic, terrifying, and somehow irresistible. The performance was unlike anything American cinema had seen. Marlon Brando was 27 years old, and he had just become the most talked about actor in Hollywood. He did not handle this the way Hollywood expected him to. He showed up late. He argued with directors. He refused to learn his lines the conventional way. He was brilliant, and he was difficult, and he knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had been reading people since childhood, exactly how much power he had, and exactly how little he intended to spend it, pleasing executives who cared nothing about art and everything about profit. But here's what people forget. Here's what gets lost in all the stories about his difficult behavior. Marlon Brando was, underneath all of it, a man who cared. deeply, sometimes inconveniently, about people who had no power in a world that was built to ignore them. He spoke at civil rights marches in the 1960s, long before it was fashionable for Hollywood stars to have political opinions. He walked with James Baldwin. He called Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't performing generosity for cameras. He was showing up in places where cameras rarely bothered to look. He cared about Native Americans with a particular intensity that went back years before 1973. He had spent time on reservations. He had listened to elders. He had sat with people whose entire civilization had been systematically dismantled by the country that was now handing him golden statues and calling him a genius. He knew something that made him uncomfortable every single time he accepted one of those statues. He knew what the cost of his comfort was and who was paying it. And now we come to 1972, The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, Marlon Brando as Vito Corleone, an aging patriarch whose authority is absolute and whose tenderness is heartbreaking. He stuffed cotton in his cheeks, found a particular walk, a voice barely above a whisper that somehow filled every corner of the room. There were people in the industry who had quietly concluded that Brando was finished, that the genius of the 1950s was gone. The Godfather proved them spectacularly wrong. And now, here's the moment where the real story begins. Because what happened next is not what you'd expect from a man who had just made the greatest comeback in Hollywood history. While Marlon Brando was filming The Godfather, he was also watching something on the news 2,000 miles away, Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Members of the American Indian movement had occupied the town of Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre where U.S. Army soldiers had killed approximately 300 Lakota Sioux men, women, and children. The occupation was a protest against treaty violations, against poverty on reservations, against a government that had made promises and broken them so many times the breaking had become the norm. The occupation lasted 71 days. Federal agents surrounded the town. 2 people died. Marlon Brando watched, and something crystallized inside him that had been forming for years. He knew he was going to win the Oscar. Everyone knew. The question wasn't whether, the question was what he was going to do when they called his name. He thought about it for weeks, because there was a real cost here. Not to him, not really, but there was a cost to the people he would be speaking for. If this was handled badly, it would do more harm than good. He needed someone to carry the message, someone who could stand on that stage and be impossible to dismiss. And that's when Sacheen Littlefeather entered the story. She was a young Apache activist, articulate, calm, with a stillness that commanded attention without asking for it. Part of the American Indian movement. When Marlon approached her and explained what he was thinking, her first response was not excitement. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Because if this doesn't work, it won't be your people who pay the price." Marlon looked at her. He understood exactly what she was saying. He'd been thinking the same thing. "I've written a speech," he said. 15 pages. You can read it or summarize it, whatever feels right. But I need someone who knows this fight from the inside. Someone standing there because they believe it, not because I asked them to. Sacheen Littlefeather went home and read what he had written. 15 pages, single-spaced, detailed, passionate, historically grounded. He had listed treaty violations by name, cited specific policies. This was not a celebrity dabbling in politics. This was a man who had spent years educating himself about a subject most of his peers found too uncomfortable to touch. She agreed to go. Now, here's something most accounts of that night leave out entirely, something that reframes the whole story. The night before the ceremony, Marlon Brando received a phone call from the Academy. They had gotten wind of what he was planning. The call was polite, carefully worded. The gist was simple. "We would strongly prefer it if you accepted your award in person." Marlon listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "I understand your preference," and he hung up. He had made his decision, not impulsively, never impulsively. Whatever people might think, he had made it with the same deliberate weight he brought to every performance. He knew the cost. He had counted it. He had decided it was worth paying. March 27, 1973. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Sacheen Littlefeather arrived backstage. She was wearing a buckskin dress and moccasins. The people backstage looked at her with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Someone told her that if she spoke for more than 45 seconds, security had instructions to remove her from the stage. 45 seconds to deliver 15 pages. She stood backstage and made a decision that required more composure than most people will ever be asked to find. She was going to walk onto that stage in front of the most powerful people in American entertainment, and she was going to say what needed to be said. The presenter stepped to the microphone. The words came. And the winner is Marlon Brando, for The Godfather. The applause was immediate and warm. Everyone in that room knew how good the performance was. And then something happened that the room was not prepared for. A young woman walked to the microphone, not Marlon Brando. A young Apache woman in a buckskin dress, moving through the applause with a stillness that cut right through the noise. The room didn't go quiet immediately. It took a few seconds for reality to register. Who is this? Where is Brando? What is happening? Sacheen Littlefeather reached the microphone. She took a breath. Her voice did not tremble. Hello, my name is Sacheen Littlefeather. I'm Apache, and I am president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee. I'm representing Marlon Brando this evening, and he has asked me to tell you, in a very long speech which I cannot share with you presently because of time, but I will be glad to share with the press afterward, that he very regretfully cannot accept this very generous award. A pause. The room completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of an audience listening. The silence of people trying to calculate what was happening and what they were supposed to feel about it. And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry, and on television in movie reruns, and also with the recent happenings at Wounded Knee. That was it. She stepped back from the microphone. The room responded. And here's what you need to understand. Because it was not one thing, it was several things at once. There was applause, genuine applause, from people who understood immediately what they had witnessed. And there were boos, clear, deliberate boos, from people who felt their evening had been hijacked, who felt that Brando had used his moment to make a statement instead of a gracious acceptance speech. Clint Eastwood, presenting Best Picture shortly afterward, made a dry comment about accepting on behalf of everyone the films may have offended. The audience laughed. It was the industry reasserting its equilibrium, finding its footing, turning the disruption into a punchline. But the punchline didn't stick, because the image of Sacheen Littlefeather at that microphone was already out in the world, already on televisions across the country, already impossible to unsee. Marlon Brando watched from home. He had not attended, not from cowardice, but because he understood that his presence would have made it about him, about the drama of the refusal. By staying home, by sending Sacheen, he had made it about the cause, about the message, about the people. The message was meant to serve. This was not accidental. This was a man who had spent his entire career thinking about where the camera is and what it sees. What happened backstage after Sacheen left the stage? This is the part of the story that has never fully been told. Some of Hollywood's most powerful people were furious. Not quietly, privately furious. Openly, immediately, in the hallway furious. Words were used. Ungrateful was one of them. Grandstanding was another. There were people in that building who had made Marlon Brando rich, who had given him the platform he had just used to embarrass them in front of 1 billion television viewers, and they wanted him to understand there was a price for what he had done. They would make sure he understood, but outside, Sacheen met with the press. She read sections of Brando's full speech, 15 pages. The journalist there later said it was unlike any Oscar speech they had ever heard, because it wasn't a speech, it was a document, a reckoning. A careful, researched, passionate argument about a wrong that had been ongoing for a century and a half. The next morning, the newspaper coverage was divided, half about the courage of the gesture, half about the arrogance. Was Brando grandstanding, using someone else's cause to make a statement about his own righteousness? Was it genuine? He said very little publicly in the immediate aftermath. He had made his statement. The statement was out in the world. What other people chose to do with it was their business. Now, here's the part of this story that most people never hear, the part that reframes everything. In the years that followed that Oscar night, if you looked closely at the films being offered to Brando, at the conversations happening in offices he was never in, at the calculations being made by people controlling production budgets, you could see a shift. Subtle, deniable, but real. A man who refused to play by the rules was learning exactly how long the rules' reach extended. He retreated to his island in French Polynesia, Tetiaroa, which he had bought in 1966. He spent months there at a time, away from Hollywood, away from the machine, away from people who needed him to be useful on their terms. He came back when he came back on his own terms. In 1979, he made Apocalypse Now, delivering one of the strangest and most hypnotic performances in American cinema as Colonel Kurtz, a role that required him to do almost nothing except exist in the frame with a particular weight and darkness that no other actor could have managed. He was barely in the film. He was in every frame. His life was not easy in the years that followed. He buried one of his sons to violence and one to suicide. He carried grief in ways he never allowed the public to see, because his grief was his. He had always been territorial about what he let the world touch. But here is what his story leaves you with. Marlon Brando was the most talented actor of his generation. He changed the way film performance works at a fundamental level. He made it possible for every actor who came after him, De Niro, Pacino, Nicholson, the entire generation that reshaped American cinema, to do what they did. He handed them a template for truth, for presence, for the kind of performance that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists. He could have traded on all of that, spent his career collecting prizes and approval, and the careful management of his legacy, been the gracious, grateful recipient of Hollywood's highest honors, played the game. He didn't. He showed up at an award ceremony and sent an Apache woman to the microphone to talk about Wounded Knee. He refused the prize because the prize was being given by a system he believed had blood on its hands, and he couldn't pretend otherwise in good conscience, even when pretending would have been safer, easier, more comfortable for everyone involved. Was it perfect? Was the gesture without complication? No. Nothing that real ever is. There are legitimate arguments about whether a wealthy movie star was the right person to be making this statement, or whether it could have been made differently. Brando himself would have engaged with those arguments honestly. He was never someone who claimed to have all the answers. But he asked the question, in the biggest room he would ever stand in, with the biggest audience he would ever have. And now, this is the part of the story that will stay with you longest. In 2022, more than 30 years after that Oscar night, Sacheen Littlefeather was invited back to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for a formal event. At that event, the Academy officially apologized to her, officially acknowledged that the treatment she had received on that night, the booze, the threats of removal, the hostility had been wrong. She was 75 years old. She died 3 weeks later. She had spent 50 years carrying the weight of that night. The mockery. The way the industry had treated her in the aftermath. The roles that never came. The doors that quietly closed. She had lived long enough to hear the apology she deserved. 3 weeks later, she was gone. When you understand that, when you understand what Sacheen Littlefeather paid for agreeing to walk onto that stage, the Oscar night becomes something different. It becomes a story about what it actually costs to say something true in a room full of people who do not want to hear it, and about the people willing to pay that cost. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004. He was 80 years old. He had spent his last years largely away from the public eye, on Tetay Roa, living the life he had always wanted. Away from the machinery of fame, in a place that didn't require him to be anyone's idea of who he should be. There's a moment in the actor studio tradition, the technique that formed Marlon Brando, that he spent his whole life refining, where you strip away the performance and ask what's really happening. What does this person actually need? What are they feeling underneath everything they're showing the world? If you ask that question about the man who sent Sacheen Littlefeather to that microphone, here is what you find. A boy from Omaha who watched his parents perform love they didn't feel and decided very young that he would never pretend to feel what he didn't. A student who looked at authority and found it so hollow he got himself expelled rather than comply. An actor who looked at the most prestigious prize his industry could offer and found it insufficient. Not because the craft wasn't worthy of celebration, but because the celebration was happening in a room that refused to reckon with the harm it had done. A man who believed that if you have a voice, a real voice, the kind that reaches millions, then using it for anything less than the truth is a kind of theft. He used his voice. The room booed. Hollywood made him pay for it, slowly, over years. The people who needed to hear the message heard it, the people who needed to dismiss it dismissed it, and 50 years later the Academy stood in front of Sacheen Littlefeather and said, "We were wrong." Marlon Brando didn't live to see that, but somehow that feels like something he would have anticipated. He was always playing a long game, always thinking several moves ahead, always aware that the moment you're in is not the only moment that matters. The truth has its own schedule. It doesn't always arrive when you need it to. Sometimes it takes 50 years. Sometimes it takes longer. But it arrives. Marlon Brando spent his whole life betting on that. Betting that the truth eventually would be stronger than the system protecting itself from it. Betting that the silence he was refusing to keep was worth the price of refusing. He was right. He was difficult and contradictory, and sometimes self-sabotaging, and always right about the things that mattered most. The boy from Omaha who couldn't make his parents stop fighting. The student who got expelled rather than comply. The actor who turned down the Oscar because he couldn't take the prize with a clear conscience. On a March night in 1973, in a glittering pavilion in Los Angeles, when a young Apache woman walked to a microphone and spoke the words he had written, words about truth, about history, about the cost of silence, Marlon Brando, watching from home, knew something that the booing room did not. He knew the moment would outlast the boos. He was right about that too.